Wichita, Tawakoni, Kickapoo, the names of 3 tribes that inhabited the land now called North Central Texas. Kaw, Kickapoo, Sioux, Osage, Sac and Fox, Prairie Band of Potawatomi. 6 tribes with ties to the land now called northeastern Kansas, the place I live now. Kelly Yarbrough, that's me. I'm a visual artist and a total prairie nerd. I'm going to talk a lot about prairie ecology in the next few minutes, but it's important to remember that people are also part of a place's ecosystem. We have so much accumulated history and traditional wisdom from many different cultures that we can learn from to restore healthy relationships with land. And I hope that each one of us here today recognizes that we have the power to choose to participate in that learning and restoration work. My personal history starts in Plano, Texas, just down the road. Plano was a Dallas bedroom community in the 80s, turned corporate headquarters mecca today. I grew up a suburban kid through and through. My mom was always an avid gardener, and I remember this one time going on an errand with her to this plant store on the outskirts of town that had these very special, more expensive plants called native plants. And I remember thinking that these native plants looked so different and exotic compared to the normal pansies and petunias I had seen at other plant stores. And it might seem strange to think that native plants looked so exotic to me as a kid, but of course they would if your whole world was dominated by turf lawns and suburban landscaping. Now, I came to Austin College in 2005, and some of you may know that Austin College actually manages Snead Restoration Prairie a few miles west of town here. Did I visit when I was a student? No, I didn't. I wasn't yet prairie aware. That didn't happen until I moved to Manhattan, Kansas, where I live now. Manhattan is at the north end of a region called the Flint Hills, which is a very special place because it's the last remaining contiguous tract of tallgrass prairie left anywhere in the world. Tallgrass prairie is actually one of the world's most endangered ecosystems. Only about 4% of it remains. But it's in the heart of this 4% that I learned about the power of perenniality. Botanically speaking, perennial plants are the ones that live longer than 2 years, as opposed to annuals or biannuals. Many wildflowers are perennials. Perennials are tried and true. They're returning friends that you start to recognize year after year. You mark time by their appearance. But the word perennial also has some interesting definitions that relate to time. Perennial can refer to something that lasts for a long time. It can mean something that reoccurs many times, or it can even be used as a synonym for infinity, which is basically like being outside of time. Now, the prairie is dominated by perennial plants. These plants have deep roots that reach down into the porous limestone bedrock, which of course is there because 250 million years ago, the Permian Sea covered most of North America. And when those seawaters receded, they left a network of gently rolling hills. But the tall, dense grasses that grow there today still move in the wind like waves, echoing their marine history. Talk about big-time perenniality. But it's not just majestic views that draw me to this place. I believe that when you're present in this perennial landscape, the prairie offers a greater understanding of life as an ecosystem. The prairie shows how communities survive and thrive together. It teaches us to be mindful of consequences and of power structures. It urges us to consider the long view when making decisions. And it models resiliency, how to work collaboratively with our neighbors and have patience with ourselves. Picture this. You're driving away from a city and the landscape starts to change to farmland. You pass rows and rows of crops. How many different crops do you see growing in a single farm field as you pass by? Usually just one, right? That's because modern agriculture says that the best way to produce a crop product is through monoculture, growing one plant at a time. It's efficient and it's predictable, at least until conditions change. Pests become immune to new pesticides. Fungus becomes immune to new fungicides. It's basically a biological arms race that also puts toxic runoff into our water systems. Plus, soil that's tilled every year gets stripped bare of its nutrients. Growing in monoculture may be efficient for short-term production, but long-term, it's really ecologically fragile. Modern agriculture is not perennial. However, there's a place in Kansas called the Land Institute that actually has a mission of bringing perennial polyculture back into the way we do agriculture. They work with teams of scientists to crossbreed common crop plants with native prairie plants. Now, a lot of our modern crops come from prairie plants that have been cultivated over thousands of years. The wild simply bred out of them. The problem is that when plants make their way towards domestication, they end up losing some really helpful genes along the way. So the Land Institute is actually reintroducing that diversity into the genetics of crop plants. And they're planting in polycultures. They're planting multiple plants together at the same time so they can help each other out and be stronger together. This is how native prairies work on their own. A healthy native prairie is a living tapestry of communities that's in constant communication and exchange with each other. Let me ask you another question. Have you ever been in a board meeting, say, and looked around the table and realized that all the faces look the same? Or perhaps you're the one that's different and you constantly feel like you're the one that has to speak up, go against the grain, making things inefficient. Perhaps we also tend to cultivate monocultures in our human communities. Perhaps we breed out dissent, so to speak, thinking that we're strengthening our positions, when in fact we're making our own communities ecologically fragile. Perhaps intentionally cultivating diversity actually makes us stronger and more resilient as a whole. That term resiliency, it's kind of come to replace the word sustainability in a lot of contexts, hasn't it? Resiliency is more about an active response to change or trauma. It's about adaptation. I see resiliency modeled in the prairie through acts of creation in response to trauma. Now, the prairie needs certain types of ecological trauma to be what it is. Fire and grazing are two of the big ones. As humans, though, we tend to want to minimize risk and contain threats. Fire, bad, don't want to be around that. Bison, very nearly eradicated by white settlers who saw Indians as a threat. Now, bison and cattle are both common grazers in Kansas today, but bison have some special characteristics that make them truly of the prairie. In the hot, buggy summers on the plains, bison will roll around in the dust and create these large, shallow depressions called wallows. The packed earth of the wallow will actually retain rainwater, giving the bison a little extra watering hole, or making a nice, cool mud bath for him to roll around in. Sometimes these wallows will actually stay wallows for decades and decades and decades, offering generations of bison an oasis. Other times, these abandoned bison wallows will transform into new micro-ecosystems, offering just a little more precipitation to plants than the patches of earth around it. You want to know another cool thing about bison? Yeah. We have some pretty epic storms on the Great Plains, right? And what does the National Weather Service tell us humans to do when a tornado has been spotted on the ground? Come on, North Texas, let me hear ya. Take shelter immediately. Okay, yeah, you've heard that, yeah. Bison don't do that, though. Instead of turning and running away from an approaching storm, bison will actually turn and face the storm and walk right through it together. Have you ever had a chance to be like an abandoned bison wallow? Have you witnessed a place or a community that's experienced trauma and you've had the opportunity to respond with creativity, collaboration, bringing new life, helping to cultivate new micro-ecosystems. Or perhaps you've faced a threat that needs head-on confrontation. Perhaps you've had to turn and walk through that storm. Maybe you have had to be the bison. Fire is a particularly dramatic form of ecological trauma that we hear about almost every year now because of the huge wildfires out in the West. There's many contributing factors to these fires, but a big one is actually fire suppression. Fire is a healthy part of most ecosystems. It clears out dead plant matter, opens up space for new growth, promotes biodiversity. But as humans spread out and develop into wilderness areas, that natural fire becomes less and less acceptable. All that dead plant matter builds up and becomes kindling, ready to ignite. When we suppress natural fire, we actually end up increasing the risk of really catastrophic fire. The Flint Hills of Kansas, however, has a very particular and thrilling fire culture that I'm not sure exists anywhere else. In the springtime, ranchers and landowners will gather teams together to perform controlled burns. About 2.4 million acres gets burned in the Flint Hills every year. Neighbors and friends will pitch in with water and equipment to help each other out, many of them never having had any formal burn training, but learning this ritual by practice. I've had the opportunity to help out on a couple of these controlled burns, and I have to say it is pretty awesome to watch a landscape burn in front of your eyes and think that you have some sense of control over it. It's also pretty obvious at any moment what could happen if you lost that control. It becomes essential to stay in constant communication with your team and know where you are most safe at any given moment. See, fire needs fuel to keep going, of course, and you don't want to be in between the fire and its fuel. So it may seem counterintuitive, but you're actually safest where the fire has just passed through and left the ground totally burnt and charred. Have you ever faced a threat that has threatened to overwhelm you, something that you alone can't stop? Sometimes change comes slowly, and sometimes it comes all at once. Sometimes it's key to recognize where that fire's fuel is coming from and remove yourself from the situation. Sometimes it's most important to keep your people close and stay in communication with them. Know where you can be most safe. So I hope I'm inspiring in you some curiosity about the prairie, because here's the kicker. Remember how I said there's only about 4% of it left? This landscape won't be around if we don't actively protect it. There's a reason I didn't recognize the native plants of my home in that garden store when I was a kid. Prairie has been removed from our developed spaces, and it took me moving to Kansas to figure that out and what it means. I was back home visiting Plano once. I went to this park that had let some native wildflowers grow up in place of the mowed lawn, and I heard a guy nearby look over at it and say, "Ugh, looks awful. Wish they had left the lawn." I wanted to turn around and shake him and say, "Who colonized your idea of beauty, man?" Come on, the idea that a turf lawn is somehow attractive is implanted in our brains. It's not natural. I feel like part of my job as a visual artist is to challenge these concepts of beauty. But understand, too, it's not just pretty flowers that have been removed from the landscape. It's peoples, it's cultures, and it's knowledge of how to live in and with the world. These are the things we lose when we lose prairie. Let's not end on a downer, though. Good news. A couple of years ago, I learned that just minutes from the house I grew up in, where prairie was an unknown landscape to me, I discovered that there's a 72-acre Texas prairie preserve called Connemara Meadow. And even though it's surrounded by urban sprawl on all sides, its teams of volunteers have been working to actively restore native Texas prairie for the past 10 or more years. The last time I visited, they had just reintroduced a new generation of baby quail back into the landscape. They're cute, aren't they? I may not live in Texas anymore, but I still feel pride when I see folks caring for the true native landscape of my home. So whether you live in Dallas, Texas, or Manhattan, Kansas, or somewhere totally different, you have access to native landscapes somewhere in proximity to you. And I encourage you to find those places and the people that help protect them. I want to leave you with this. It's a stanza from a poem written by a young poet who overcame a childhood speech impediment to become our nation's first youth poet laureate. And as I listened to her read this poem on the steps of the US Capitol, I was surprised and ecstatic because I heard Prairie embedded in her words. I heard creativity, community, resiliency, perenniality. From the sixth stanza of The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Thank you.